Check. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm just using this mic so that people can hear me on Zoom. Jin, come on in. We just started. Thank you for coming. So my name is Loveland Finley. If I haven't met you yet, I'm the Assistant Director of the Crummer Alumni Relations, working with our remarkable group of alumni, including General, Lieutenant, Doctor, Author, Professor. I can keep going. Mark Hertling is one of the highlights of my role. I consider myself fortunate to call him my friend and address him by these esteemed titles. Mark. Instead of delving into his extensive biography tonight, I want to emphasize that Mark, Dr. Hertling, is truly one of the most outstanding individuals I have ever met. I always sporting a smile, that kind of smile right there. And I deeply appreciate his generosity in giving back to our school. We are grateful that he wanted to do this event. This was his idea, and I was happy to host him, and we're always happy to host you. And, as we commemorate and celebrate the 100-year history of honoring and caring for those who made the ultimate sacrifice and rest in 26 cemeteries across the globe. Without further ado, I'm going to give you the mic. I present Lieutenant General Hertling.
It is great to be with all of you. Thank you, first of all, for coming. As Loveland just said, this is an act of love for me. First of all, when you hear the story that very few people know about, which I'm going to tell tonight, about the American Battle Monuments Commission, you'll understand why it's something that I hold deep in my heart. And it is the 100th year anniversary of the founding of the commission. It was founded in 1923 on the 4th of March. I'll give you a little bit of the history of that. But the man on the slide you see right there is General John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing. He's in his civilian clothes for the first time in that shot, going back to Europe after the war was over. He had just been retired for about a month, but he was the one that came up with the idea for the cemeteries. Then he was put in control of the monuments. And then Congress said, you're the guy that we're going to appoint as the first chairman. Well, up until just a few months ago, I had the great honor of being appointed by President Biden to be a commissioner, one of 11 commissioners on this American Battle Monuments Commission, and my peers elected me as the chairman. I didn't serve as long as Pershing did. He served from 1923 until 1948, and then was replaced by a guy who was probably not as well known as him, a guy named George C. Marshall. And Marshall served as the chairman for about another 10 years. And then he was replaced by a series of other general officers of the modern era that, if I name their names, like P.X. Kelly and Fred Franks and Jake Devers, some of you who are historians would know who I'm talking about because they were all American heroes. But I just feel lucky to be a part of that group. And because of that, as we lead into Memorial Day, I'd like to tell you the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. The title of this presentation is, you see, time will not dim the glories of their deeds. This is a remark that General Pershing made when he dedicated the very first monument at Chateau Thierry. And it's been kind of the mantra of the American Battle Monuments Commission since then. It's always good to start with faces. Now, these were a group of individual deployed soldiers who were replacement troops in World War I. This was before they had seen any action. You can see they're clean shaven. They've got all their equipment. There's very little mud. They didn't quite know what to do, but General Pershing, as the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, told the training base back in the United States, he said to them, you know, they were thinking up all kinds of things that they could train these guys on in basic training as America went from an army of 27,000 to 2 million in a 6-month period of time. He told the training base, just teach them how to salute and how to shoot, and I'll do the rest. That's generalship. But I wanted to show you their faces because even though they're standing there with their gas mask and their canteens and they're outside the front lines, those are the youth of America who probably didn't know what they were getting into, the hell of combat. We can connect them to Ukraine today, fighting in the trenches, just like they were doing for multiple months. So there is that connection. But that's really who we're going to talk about. And that picture was taken near the Somme before they went into the fight. After the fight, and I'm getting right into what the American Battle Monuments Commission is all about, for the first time in America's history, we had literally tens of thousands of soldiers who had been killed in action. And they were over there. This was not the American Civil War where carriages would take bodies back to their homes, or where they would be buried on site at places like Gettysburg or Antietam or other places where there are national cemeteries today, or even Arlington Cemetery. And I don't know how many of you know the history of Arlington, but Arlington was a plantation that belonged to the Custis family. Custis was General Lee's father-in-law. And a general at the time said, hey, we're really going to stick it to that Bobby Lee. Let's take his father-in-law's plantation, which he's going to inherit, and let's turn it into a cemetery and first bury the first soldiers of the Civil War around the back porch of their plantation house. So if you go to Arlington today and you see a huge mansion on the hill above the Washington Bridge, that is the Custis House. And if you go up there, the tombstones start in about 1862 and go outward from there. But that was our experience. We never had the experience of having close to 120,000 soldiers who had been killed in action somewhere across the sea. I'd like you to take a look at that impromptu cemetery right there. And as you can see, I don't know if you notice it or not, crosses with names written on them, but those crosses are made out of picket fences. So they were improvised at the time, and they were usually put in the ground where near the battles were. And they were all over Europe. And the United States government had the difficult problem to say, how do we get these bodies disinterred and sent back to the United States? It was a logistics problem beyond your imagination. But there was another problem too, because after the war, where's my friend there he is, who's doing the study on monuments. After the war, there was a problem that as soon as the war was over, you had close to about 1 million soldiers in Europe waiting for ships to take them home. And let me tell you, from a guy who used to command soldiers, when you got that many people doing nothing, they get into a lot of trouble. Or if it's after a war, they memorialize themselves. So some of their commanders and some of the soldiers were writing back to their states back in the United States saying, hey, we did a great job over here and somebody needs to remember us. So governments back in the United States started sending money over to build monuments. That one at the top is the Pennsylvania Monument. And it was built before the French could say anything about it. And oh, by the way, the French were saying the same thing to their soldiers. We want to honor you. And if you travel around Europe, either France, Germany, the Netherlands, if you go to any given town today, usually in the town square, there's at least one monument to World War I and World War II. And what's fascinating about that is the French government was issuing money to different towns throughout the entire, well, the realm of France, Before the French soldiers and leaders could build their monuments, the doggone Americans were doing it first. And they were doing it at large sites and at small sites. This is a monument that a group of soldiers built to their commanding officer in the middle of a farmer's field. So you can understand that these things were literally all over the place. Today, even though some of these have been dug up and shipped back to the United States, today there are still about 1,300 monuments in Europe that had been dedicated by states and individuals. They do not belong to the American Battle Monuments Commission. You'll see that in a second. Pershing made the decision only to go with monuments to large army movements. So some of them, like the Pennsylvania monument, still exist, but it doesn't fall under us. It's up to the state of Pennsylvania to care and maintain that thing. So you see what I'm talking about in terms of a logistics issue and a political issue that was plaguing the United States after the war to end all wars was over. So here's a decision timeline. I'm sorry, you can't see that. The line underneath there basically says that the government was struggling with how to return soldiers. What they came up with, but the Secretary of War said, the only thing we can do is give the American families one of two choices. They can either ask us to bring them home, which means it'll take a few years to do, or we can bury them in Europe. And there was a great debate in Congress with a lot of congressmen saying, oh, it doesn't matter the cost, let's bring them home. And the more pragmatic we're saying, well, yeah, this is going to become very expensive and it's going to take a long time. And oh, by the way, we should keep our soldiers on foreign soil. And kind of a quote that's been used recently came up at the time that said, hey, the only thing that America does when they go to war, they never occupy foreign lands. They only ask for enough ground to bury their dead. That's where that came from about 1990. Then in early 20, as I told you the story about the monuments, the United States government first started getting messages from the French, basically saying, I'm kind of making it more succinct, will you knock it off? You've got too many monuments to America in French soil. So Congress established something called the Battle Monuments Board to determine how to deal with these two big issues of logistics and monuments. And they debated it, much like Congress often does, for 2 years. And recommended something called the American Battle Monuments Commission problem for them. Now, Pershing came back from the war as the commander of the forces in Europe and was appointed as the chief of staff of the Army, so the #1 general in the Army. He was dealing with all kinds of problems. After action reports, a new signal corps, this new thing called tanks, and how many do we build? Airplanes are now new, so do we start an Army Air Corps? He had all sorts of operational issues, and they're asking him about monuments and bodies. These were his soldiers. So he was a lot more concerned about the bodies and honoring them than he could care less about the state's view of their monuments. So basically, he retired in 1922. So Congress, never taking advice from the military, as they're prone to do, said, well, let's put him in charge. Let's put Mr. Pershing in charge. So John J. Pershing became the first chairman of the ABMC. And with these couple of other guys, he had a congressman in that group. Don't ask me to point him out. I don't know which one it was. He had a Gold Star father of 4 boys who had been killed in action in World War I as part of the group. He had an engineer, he had another soldier, and he had a businessman who would raise money through various funds to try and fund this thing. That was the original American Battle Monuments Commission in 1923. And they were at the cemetery at Suresnes outside of Paris in this shot. Pershing, being a general, said, hey, we always got to have a mission statement. This was his original mission statement of what he wanted to do. There were 9 sites at the time throughout Europe. And he got in kind of a big fight with, and there were 15 grand memorials, as he called them, that were already being built. But he kind of got into a semi-fight with the Veterans Administrations because they're in charge of cemeteries back in the United States. So what Pershing said is, hey, how about if ABMC takes all of the ones outside of our borders and the Veterans Administration takes all the things inside the borders? We will take large monuments outside of our borders, and the National Park Service will take large monuments inside of our borders. Okay, everybody good with that? They came to agreement. That agreement has since been muddied quite a bit, and I'll explain more of that in just a second. Just when things were starting to be pulled together, World War II began. Pershing is still the chairman of the American Battle Monuments Commission, but as you all can understand, for as many deceased soldiers, as many soldiers who sacrificed their lives in World War I, there were about 3 times as many in World War II. And they were not only in Europe, they were all over the globe. So that expanded the role of the ABMC. And in 1947, Congress readdressed the issue and gave some new rules. Today, this is what we look like. And when I say we, I am no longer a part of the commission. I should say that. I left the commission just a few weeks ago. But I'm giving this presentation because I admire all the things that they do. And they asked me to continue to do some presentations for them. But you'll see that in the different wars, there were different numbers of soldiers killed, certainly, and left overseas. But secondly, there were a lot more monuments being built as well. I mentioned 117,000 that were killed in action in World War I. You'll see that in World War I cemeteries, we have 35,000. That's because family members made the decision. About 60% of the families said, bring the remains of our soldiers home. About 40% said, leave them there. And since then, there have been some more that have been disinterred. And interestingly enough, as many as have been disinterred, there's been about 4 times as many who have said, we would like our soldiers who are back in the United States, our father, our grandfather, to be moved with his buddies at Normandy or one of the cemeteries overseas, and we can't do that. Just so you know, those are the numbers we have right now in ABMC that we care for in different sites. What I'm going to show you too is a couple of films, if you don't mind. They're short. They're about 2.5 minutes long each. I have 4 of them in the presentation. I took random sites that we maintain just so you get a feel. And as I show you these sites, what I'd like you to do is take a look at not just the honor of providing the final resting place for some of these soldiers, but also the architecture and the artwork that is in each one of these cemeteries. If any of you have ever been to one of these sites, you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever been to Arlington Cemetery, what I would suggest is these are much more beautiful than anything at Arlington. And I'm not saying that as a competition. I'm just saying because the majority of these sites that are cared for by the host nation personnel. So most of the people that work as part of the American Battle Monuments Commission, we have a total of 500 people in our small commission. About 300 of them are host nation workers, and they have master's degrees in horticulture, PhDs. They are tradesmen and craftsmen in those different art forms, and it is just absolutely magnificent. These are our sites all over the world today. I've been to most of them, not all, so I can try and answer questions about some of them if you have any specific questions. But those are the places we have either monuments or cemetery sites. 32 memorials, 26 cemeteries. This is the one that everyone knows. It is the most visited of our 26 cemeteries. It's the the Normandy American Cemetery. And I'll just show you this film very quickly.
This is the coastline of Normandy, France, where the legendary D-Day beach landings took place. American forces suffered over 4,000 casualties on Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of 5 landing sites on the Normandy coast on June 6, 1944. This was D-Day, the epic event that altered the course of World War II. Today, the Normandy American Cemetery, sited on a bluff high above the coast, is one of the world's best-known military memorials. These hallowed grounds preserve the remains of nearly 9,400 Americans who died during the Allied liberation of France. 3 Medal of Honor recipients rest here. 45 sets of brothers lie side by side. The Visitor Center describes the events and the significance of the D-Day landings and the ensuing campaign for Normandy. Every year, over 1 million visitors come to pay their respects to the fallen and learn more about the crucial events that happened here. Within the picturesque trees, an immense array of headstones rises in long regular rows. At the west end of the cemetery, granite statues represent the United States and France. A small chapel sits at the center of the cemetery. Inside, a ceiling mosaic depicts America blessing her sons as they depart to fight for freedom. In the open arc of the memorial, a bronze statue symbolizes the indomitable spirit of American youth. Over 1,500 names are carved on the walls in the Garden of the Missing, behind the memorial. The daunting challenges and intense combat of the campaigns to liberate France live on in this inspiring burial ground, the final resting place for so many courageous American servicemen and women.
A couple of thoughts. It is the Normandy American Cemetery and the nearby Pont de Hoc, which is where the U.S. Rangers scaled a cliff on D-Day. And if you've ever seen a picture of that, it is just unbelievable what those soldiers did on that day, are combined, and they see the most American visitors. As the narrator said, last year we had 2.5 million. During the COVID years, of course, it reduced. For America, that we have. The least is a site in Tunisia, where the North African invasion occurred under Patton and Bradley. But I'm going to show you another one that is not visited much by Americans, but it has the most visitors every year, about 9,000, and that's in Manila, the Philippines. And you'll understand why as soon as you see the film. It is in a park outside the city of Manila.
Manila American Cemetery is located in the capital city of the Philippines. It is the largest of all American overseas military cemeteries, occupying over 150 acres on a prominent plateau with a breathtaking view of the Manila skyline. Here rest more than 17,000 American servicemen and women. Most lost their lives in the Philippines and New Guinea during World War II, but over a dozen campaigns across the Pacific are represented here. Among the war dead are 29 Medal of Honor recipients. In 20 instances, 2 brothers lie side by side. Over 500 Philippine scouts who served with their American comrades in the Philippines are buried here. A visitor center, almost entirely enclosed by glass, is located near the Memorial Court. The exhibit tells the story of the brutal combat and conditions experienced in the vast Pacific Theater. The chapel stands at the center of the burial grounds. On the face of the chapel, a large sculpture of St. George battles the dragon. Inside, a stunning blue glass mosaic behind the altar depicts a Madonna offering flowers to the honored dead. In 4 map rooms, 25 mosaic maps describe campaigns in the Southwest Pacific and China, Burma, India theaters. On the wide terrace, a limestone hemisphere contains an astonishing 36,000 names of those whose bodies were not found. The Manila American Cemetery tells an epic story of sacrifice and valor in the service of liberty.
On the wall of the missings at each one of our cemetery, if the government has an agency called DPAA, don't ask me what it stands for, but it's the organization where military personnel are all over the world looking for missing in actions or former prisoner of wars that are still in the country. When someone on the wall of the missing from either World War I, Korea, World War II is found, they aren't buried there. They are sent back to their family, but a small rosette is placed next to the name on the wall. So as you visit some of these cemeteries and you see these literally thousands of names that are carved into these walls of the missing, you'll see small rosettes, which means the body has been recovered. This cemetery in Manila is absolutely gorgeous. It's on a huge plot of land, but a lot of it's also connected. It's part of the only green space in the city of Manila. So a lot of people go there to literally have picnics, certainly not where the remains are or where the graves are, but nearby. So it has become somewhat of a gathering place for some of the citizens of Manila. Now, I've shown you 2 cemeteries that are focused on World War II. What I'd like to do now is do one more, if you don't mind, that has to do with World War I. Whenever our politicians go to Paris, they go to one of 2 places to lay a wreath. They either go to the American Cemetery at Suresnes, which I'll talk about, which is literally inside the boundary of Paris. And if you look at some of the artwork out there, you'll see one of the pictures is on top of a hill at Suresnes. The Eiffel Tower is literally in the foreground, and it's a beautiful site. It's a World War I cemetery. The second one we just received back from the French government. It was originally a French monument to the Lafayette Escadrille and the Americans that fought as part of the fledgling Air Corps in France in World War I. These guys were amazing. And I will tell you a story at the end of the film, but we're talking about individuals just a few years after the Wright brothers flew the first plane. They're now saying, hey, let's take this new invention and put it to use in warfare. And when you look at the history of some of these aviators, most of them were volunteers to learn how to fly and then fly these things. And the difficulties of flying these aircraft with cloth wings, with machine guns mounted on the top wings, so they literally have to stand up in the cockpit, steer with their legs while they're shooting the machine gun, and at the same time flying the air. The majority of these individuals were killed when they landed, because the wooden struts of the airplane as they would land on grass fields would break, the airplane would flip over, and it would be a crash. But fascinating stories, and I'll tell you one more at the end of this film. This is the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial, given to us by the French in 2017 because they were having challenges keeping it up.
Lafayette Escadrille Memorial Cemetery is in a secluded wooded park just west of Paris. On the far side of a clearing, a huge ornate arch, much like the Arc de Triomphe, rises majestically before a wide reflecting pond. It commemorates Americans who flew for France during World War I, members of the famous Lafayette Escadrille and Lafayette Flying Corps. Stairs under the arch lead to a crypt. This is the final resting place for 48 American aviators, 1 Canadian aviator, and 2 of their French commanding officers. These aviators were Americans who volunteered to fight for France, even before the United States entered the war. They fought in such monumental battles as Verdun and the Somme Offensive, establishing a reputation for daring and skill. Alongside the crypts, bright stained glass windows depict the role of the airplane in major battles of the war. A visitor center tells the remarkable story of the origins of American aviation in World War I. The monument visually compares the fighting spirit of the American volunteers with the indomitable warrior tradition of Native American nations. The unit insignia chosen by the Lafayette Escadrille honors a stylized Plains Indian chief in war dress. In 2017, ABMC officially assumed responsibility for the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial Cemetery. This memorial serves as a symbol of the long comradeship between France and the United States and pays tribute to the pilots who were America's first combat aviators.
I'm kind of an amateur history buff, and I like fun facts whenever I go places. So I don't know if you noticed the stylized comparison between the Native American Indian chief and the pilots with their flowing scarves and their helmets and all that. And when I was at, have interpretive guides from the host nation at all of these sites, guides that will take you around and tell you more. So as I was being escorted about a year ago through the Lafayette Escadrille, I asked about this young French woman. She was about 18 years old. And I said, what's the deal with the scarves? You know, I'm a soldier. I don't get that whole scarf thing. And she goes, oh, monsieur, it has a very practical purpose. I said, please tell me, because my Air Force buddies are still wearing them. And she said, well, they would wear the scarf because they were in an open cockpit airplane. They were very cold when they were flying. So they would put on this outer gear. And most of the outer gear they had was, you know, cloth and leather. And when they'd turn their head to get the views of German planes coming up to attack them, they wanted something around their neck so they wouldn't chafe their neck. So they started wearing silk scarves. So if anyone ever asks you why American pilots wear silk scarves, that's the reason why. It's a holdover tradition. But it's fascinating because this monument contains the fewest number of remains, as you heard, 48 Americans, but it receives some of the most vivid attention because it literally is considered the birthplace of American aviation. But what's fascinating about that, whenever there's a great story, there's also usually a sad story that goes along with it. And this is the sad story. This is Eugene Jack Bullard, the very first African-American pilot who was not accepted into the Lafayette Escadrille. You can read his history. This guy, I've read a book about him, and he is just absolutely phenomenal. He is not memorialized at the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial. His name is on the wall as that being an American that fought for France, but they would not allow him into, because he was an African-American, into the Lafayette Escadrille. So he went and flew with the French, shot down 2 German airplanes, was considered a real hero, had the most medals for valor of any American or Frenchman coming out of the war. And as you see, he was made a chevalier, and I hope I'm pronouncing that wrong. All soldiers never pronounce other languages very well, but he was named a chevalier. Is that right? Thank you. I appreciate that. But for those of you who are seeing the movie trailers for this new movie called Chevalier, about the guy that was the swordsman and the violinist, he is part of that order. Thankfully, in 1994, the United States Air Force gave him a commission as a second lieutenant. I don't get that, but I'm an Army guy, so the Air Force must have a reason for it. And they have named their museum at Dayton, the Dayton Air Force Museum after Jack Bullard. The fascinating thing about this guy, in 1960, Charles de Gaulle was visiting the United States, visiting John Kennedy, and they wrote a message, or part of message traffic from Charles de Gaulle was the only person he really wanted to meet was this guy. And the Kennedy administration said, who's this guy, Jack Bullard? Who the heck is he? Well, they found him working as an elevator operator in Nashville, Tennessee. He never bragged about his exploits. He finished his life working as a bodyguard for Louis Armstrong, and also later working the elevators in NBC, the NBC, what's it called? Their theater in New York, you know, Rockefeller Center. So quite an interesting character. But just like there are unbelievable stories that are a reflection of our history, good and bad, I'm going to tell, this is one of my favorite stories because it hits close to home. And it's the story of two twin sisters, Gladys and Dorothy Crowell. They were called the Angels of the AEF. Now, they volunteered. They were New York debutantes. Their father was a big wig on Wall Street. They lived with their uncle, who was the president of the New York Stock Exchange. And as 19-year-olds, they volunteered to go off to war. And all of their friends in New York were like, what are you going to do? And they said, we're going to volunteer with the American Red Cross. So they went to Europe as twin sisters together. They were immediately sent to the front lines. You can see they're given chocolate to wounded soldiers on the front lines. And again, I'm going to make the comparison to Ukraine today. The amount of artillery that was landing, that was causing what we now know today as post-traumatic stress disorder, was known back then as a soldier's heart, because the doctors of the day didn't understand what it was. So they thought it was some type of cardiovascular disease which caused you know, people to be morose and emotionally distressed. So they were suffering on the front lines at the Somme from a soldier's heart. Their boss, someone from the American Red Cross, said, hey, we need to ship you back to Paris and give you a little bit of rest. You've been out here suffering under artillery shells for such a long time. So they shipped them back, and that's the second picture you see here. They shipped them back to Paris, to Suresnes, which is one of our cemeteries today and where they are both buried, overlooking the Eiffel Tower. And what was happening in Paris while the front line was going on and all this fighting was happening in the trenches? Well, in Paris, they were just beginning to get the early stages of something called the Spanish flu. So they then became nurses in the American hospital, and they saw more suffering and death in the hospital in Paris than they had seen on the front line. So they began to suffer more and more from post-traumatic stress, a soldier's heart, and the war was over in 1918. They waited around for a couple of months for a troop ship to take them home. And right before they got on board the troop ship, they received a letter from their uncle, who was the president of the New York Stock Exchange, that said, please don't bring the horrors of war back with you. We don't want to hear any of your stories, or words to that effect. Now, these two young ladies had been fighting and seeing people die and taking care of them. So that letter was just a blow to their heart. They got on board the troop ship that took them home and decided one night that they would hold hands and jump off the bow of the ship. This was you can see the highlighted article in the New York Times talking about how they were debutantes from high society, couldn't understand why they would commit suicide. They were finally coming home. But when the soldiers told their families the rest of the story, they understood why. They're buried at the Suresnes Cemetery right next to each other. When I took this picture of these two crosses, I asked the site superintendent, one of our cemetery superintendents, tell me the story, and he told me this story. It's a very little known story, but what's interesting, you can't see it in this picture, it has their names, and unlike some of the other grave markers there, because they were twins, they were born on the same day, they died on the same day, their unit insignia was ARC, American Red Cross, and underneath their unit insignia unlike everyone else in that cemetery, they had the Croix de Guerre that they had been given by the French government. By the way, those are just a couple of the stories of the millions that come out of these sites and cemeteries. Where are my Dutch friends? One and two. Two people from the Netherlands. I didn't plan this. It's just happened this way. But the Netherlands American Cemetery is the favorite of my wife and I. I will tell you the story real quickly, and then I'll show you the film. But on Christmas of 2011, we were in Europe. I was commanding US Army Europe. And I got a call from one of my subordinate commanders who commanded the garrison in what we call the Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And he said, hey, boss, he says, I know your kids aren't going to be home. Why don't you and Sue come up and attend midnight mass? He says, I got a special treat for you. I said, okay, you know, it's always good to travel in Europe. So we drove up to the Netherlands. And while we were in a hotel, my wife was down in the lobby, and somehow she found out that this American cemetery was right down the road from where we were staying in a hotel. Christmas Eve. Rain was, as all Dutch rain is, was traveling sideways with the winds. It was a freezing day. And if you know European culture, usually Christmas Eve is the day of exchanging presents, and that's your traditional gift-giving day. So Sue said to me, why don't we go out to the cemetery before we go to midnight mass and just pay our respect? I had never been there before. I said, sure, let's drive there. If I'm telling this story right, you can, or if I'm doing it wrong, you can correct me. We went out there expecting no one to be there. The place was packed with Dutch citizens. They have a program where the local town of Margraten and Maastricht adopt the graves of the 8,000 soldiers, 8,000 or so soldiers. Every single grave is adopted by a family and taken care of by a family. So when we went into the cemetery, we saw people laying flowers, polishing the stones, tidying up, leaving notes. And Sue went up to a young couple that had twin boys. They were in front of two different markers, and said, you know, luckily the wife spoke English, the husband did not, the boys did. She said, why are you here? Tell us about what's going on. And she said, oh, well, this is what we do. We are teaching our children about liberty and what it takes to honor those who fight for it. That night we went to, that's the cemetery, by the way. That night we went to the midnight mass. It was held in a cave, the Deschartres Cave the Deschartres Cave is a cave, a sandstone, limestone cave owned by a bunch of monks. They have a monastery on top of it. But in 1944, a few days before the Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne, this was a rest and recreation site, the city of Margraten and Maastricht, where a lot of soldiers who had been on the front line were brought back to rest. While resting on Christmas Eve, one of the generals came and said, hey, we've got this little tussle going on at a place called Bastogne. Mount up tomorrow, everybody. Cooks, supply sergeants, truck drivers, because this fight is horrific. So on Christmas Eve, they all went to mass, and you can see that this cave is kind of separated into two parts. On one side of the cave in 1944 were all the Dutch citizens that had been recently liberated. On the other side of the cave were all the American soldiers who knew the next day they were going back into combat. And what they asked them to do, if you can see right above my head there on the wall, there's a plexiglass barrier in front of 300 names of the soldiers. They all signed their names on the wall that night. And of the 300 or so that signed their name that night, very few of them came back alive. And ever since then, since 1944, they've been holding midnight mass for the town people in this cave. This guy I'm shaking hands with is the priest that said the mass. In 1944, he had been an altar boy for the mass that was held on that night. This is the Netherlands American Cemetery.
Just 7 miles from the city center of Maastricht is the Netherlands American Cemetery. A tranquil landscape masks the country's turbulent history during World War II. Over 8,200 Americans are buried here, their headstones set in long curves. They gave their lives in the Allied struggle to free the Netherlands, easternmost Belgium, and then invade Germany itself. Private Walter Wetzel smothered the blasts of enemy grenades with his body to save the lives of his comrades. The memorial is of white Portland stone. A sculpture depicts a mourning woman flanked by hovering doves and new growth from the shattered remains of a tree. It represents new life sprouting from war's destructions, proclaiming man's immortality and hope for peace. Walls in the Court of Honor bear the names of over 1,700 missing in action. The bronze chapel doors depict a tree of life. Inside, an illuminated crown of the Netherlands hangs suspended from the chapel ceiling. Since 1945, the cemetery has had a special relationship with local people. Many bring flowers. Some adopt the graves of those who are buried here. This is their gesture of lasting thanks to the Americans who fought to liberate the Netherlands.
The American Battle Monuments Commission has gone through a couple of transformative events. Early on in the stages of the war, it was a grieving organization. And in fact, after World War I, this is one of the mothers who was on board a troop ship that came over after the war. A group of 500 mothers were allowed to do that by the US government. Their tour was paid for, but to visit the sites of their sons. It quickly became, because of time passing, an organization that was really focused on remembrance and bringing veterans back to the locations of these sites. That was obviously a picture of me with 3 guys from the 82nd Airborne Division at Normandy. And how do I say this politely? That night, they drank me under the table, telling me stories about their generals and how they were idiots and you must be a much better general than he was. But you know, when you have a couple of sergeants that are of that age and had seen the things that they saw parachuting into numerous locations, coming back here, the guy on the right, his name was Pinky. He's the only surviving member of the 3. The other 2 have since died. But Pinky was just a typical sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division. But he was a character. But what was interesting that night while we were standing around, his granddaughter had escorted him over. And as they told their stories to me around the table, his granddaughter was kind of off to the side. And she came up to me with tears in her eyes afterwards. And she said, I always thought I was very close to my grandfather. And I always asked him about the war and he would never tell me. She said, I've heard more tonight in terms of talking with his buddies and with you than I've heard in my entire life. And she was about 30 years old, I guess. And she said, I have much more respect for him now than I had before. And I had a lot of respect for him before. The picture on the bottom, this is well, I won't go into any more of the long stories because each one of them has too much of a old guy thought to it. But today, what we're attempting to do is do another transformation from grieving and remembrance, because these guys are all dying off. So what we have to do, we think, is really focus on finding ways to educate the next generation about the service and the sacrifice and the memories of these individuals who still rest in these sites. In World War I, Pershing, as the commanding general, pulled up this young buck of a major by the name of Dwight Eisenhower and said, hey, I'm going to give you 2 years to travel around Europe as part of this organization, and in 1933, and record the travels and the campaigns of the US Army in Europe. So young Major Eisenhower, who would probably need some of that information later on, got to just kind of chill and travel around Europe writing the history. And he actually published 2 books about that history for the American Battle Monuments Commission. So they are official US Army archive books, and they're available today in better bound versions than those 2. Today, what we're trying to do is do an outreach. Part of the reason I'm here tonight and why I asked Rollins to support this, and Loveland and Mike and Michael, thank you so much for all the preparation you did for helping me stand up in front of these folks. But we're trying to reach out to classrooms, to history and liberal arts and architectural programs at different universities and say, hey, we've got a gem. We've got a lot of gems of locations all over the world. So when you go on your partnership or your sabbatical to someplace, just stop by, because guaranteed one of these sites is near you. I just talked to a young student the other day who was taking a trip as part of her university to Rome. I said, we've got 2 sites within traveling distance, 30 minutes ride of Rome, Italy, that you might want to take a look at, and they have some of those beautiful architecture that you could see. So these are the things we're doing, and at each one of our sites, we don't have historical tours. What we do is we have interpretive center, interactive capability with young people who are students of history, who work for several years at one of our sites, who will grab you when you walk in the door or onto the field and say, what would you like to know? And they will give you in detail information about each one of those. So what I would ask you all to do, if any of you are planning a trip overseas on a river cruise or a cruise site or something like that, take a look at our webpage, US ABMC, and all those pieces of artwork that Mike put out front of all our different sites, and see if one of them is close by to a place that you're traveling. Okay, now here's the Rollins connection. About 24 years ago, I don't know who Cynthia Wood is. I do know that President Bornstein was one of the presidents of Rollins College back in the late 90s and early 2000s. But she received a letter that said, could we do a memorial? And when I was a doctoral student here, one day I was going over to Starbucks to get a coffee, and I happened to walk past the administration building, and I saw this thing. And I didn't think much of it other than, oh, gee, that's nice that Rollins would have a memorial to those students who have served in the armed forces and given their last full measure. When I became a part of the ABMC, I asked Mike, because as I said, Mike, send me the names on this thing. And he sent me the names, and I did a little research over here in the Rollins library. And I want to tell you a story about a couple of these guys. Ted Reed, captain of the crew team, flew multiple missions over Germany. His airplane was shot down over Frankfurt, and he was killed in action. He was recommended for a Distinguished Flying Cross, which is the 2nd highest award given by the US military for bravery in combat as an aviator. His wife was also a Rollins grad. I don't know if they're still in the area. He has a son allegedly in the Winter Park area. I tried to contact him. I couldn't find him. So I don't know if he's still here or not. But he's buried at one of the cemeteries I did not show you, the Luxembourg American Cemetery near Ham, Luxembourg. At Ham, interestingly enough, is also the burial site of George S. Patton, because Patton wanted to be buried with his troops. So when you go into the Ham Cemetery in Luxembourg, you will see the 8,000 or so tombstone markers. And right in the middle is George Patton, who was killed in an auto accident in Mainz, Germany after the war. This guy, class of 36, and I'm drawing a blank on his name. I'm sorry. I can find it for you. That little thing is covering it up. I can't see it right now. I will get it for you in a minute. But you can see what he did. Can you see it, Mike? I'm sorry. Okay. It's Walter Gordon. Thank you. That's right. That's his name. So he signed this picture, and this was displayed at his memorial service here in Rollins. You can killed during a dive bombing incident in the Pacific. His remains are buried at Manila, the film that you saw second. Third individual. I thought in research, I thought this was the most interesting one, truthfully. He was a seaman second class, class of 38. He wrote for the Sandspur. As I look through his academic records, I'm not denigrating him, but he was in constant trouble. His parents never paid his tuition. He somehow got a sabbatical to Germany during his sophomore year. And when he went over his sophomore year, he actually attended a play where a guy named Hitler was present. And he did an interview with Hitler and wrote about it in the Sandspur. He's also on the wall at the Manila Cemetery, which you saw the film of. This one is the last one I'll show you before moving on. Jack Wagner. You can see, first of all, he's a pretty handsome guy. Football, track, swimmer, three-sport athlete. He left in September, the year of his graduation, because he felt like he needed to go serve. So he's considered class of 41, but he never graduated. He was the first in, the history of the Rollins Flight Detachment is fascinating, how they trained pilots over at McConnell Field, or what is now the Executive Airport. He was one of the first ones, or he was the first solo. He was a model student. They said, this guy is going to be an unbelievable aviator. While his ship, the USS Ranger, was going overseas to Europe to fight in 1941, he was doing a patrol mission ahead of the ship. And as you'll see in this letter from a commanding officer, and I'm sure you can't read it, but I'll describe it. This is a letter from the commander of the USS Ranger, an aircraft carrier, to the parents, telling them how Jack's aircraft went down within vision of the ship. He was coming in on final approach, and then for whatever reason, the aircraft flipped over. His wingman circled around him, tried to get him. His co-pilot or his navigator was in the plane with him. His navigator got out. They think that Jack was, and this is part of the letter that Captain Durgan sent to the parents, saying that he was trying the best he could to right the aircraft so it could be recovered. And then suddenly the aircraft went down. So Jack drowned. His name is on the wall at the East Coast Monument, which is at the very tip of Manhattan in New York. I was in New York last week, and I actually walked down and visited and saw Jack's name. The reason I'm ending with this is because, for a couple of reasons. First of all, as a commanding officer, I've had to write a lot of these letters. And I brought something with me tonight that I've talked about in the past. This is an old cigar box, a wooden one, which 3 people have. Inside of it are a bunch of cards, and I don't want to hold it up because they'll all fall out, but they look like this. And these are the names and faces of 253 soldiers that I lost under my command in combat. I just picked 3 of them out just at random. Staff Sergeant Kalita Davis, she was a medic from Alaska. Her and her husband, who was also a soldier, had 6 children. She was a staff sergeant. One of her medics came up and was sick and couldn't go out on a patrol. And she said, I'll take the patrol for you this time. She went out on patrol and her medical vehicle was hit in by an improvised explosive device, and she died. Corporal Luke Runyon, he's an interesting guy. He was living with his wife and 2 children in Germany, along with Sue and I, before we deployed. He was part of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. He, by coincidence, 2 weeks before, I have a picture of going to his base, and my sergeant major was talking to a group of soldiers, as sergeant majors always do. And he came up to me afterwards and he goes, hey, sir, he says, I just talked to this kid over here, Corporal Runyon, and he asked me a weird question. He said, Sergeant Major, would you do it all over again? And he said, what do you mean? And he said, would you serve again? You've served for 30 years, you're in combat again. Would you do it again? And Sergeant Major had a long sit-down talk with him, but he remembered the name of Runyon. About 2 weeks later, we got notification that Runyon was killed by small arms fire on a dismounted patrol. The third one I picked up by coincidence, because I keep going back to him, Sergeant Major Eric Cook, a 33-year veteran. My wife and his wife, Dagmar, were very close. We both lived, well, he lived in Freiburg. We lived in Heidelberg. No, where were we? We were in Hanau at the time, Hanau, Germany. And on Christmas Eve, we were having a major operation in 2003. And I was out on the streets, and about 100 yards away, the brigade got a call saying that they had a downed soldier, and it turned out to be Sergeant Major Cook, who was the brigade command sergeant major. Now, a brigade command sergeant major is the senior most enlisted advisor for a unit that has about 4,000 people. So everybody knew this guy, and he was universally loved. And his wife was a German national that he had married when he was a young soldier in Germany. And it was a hard pill to swallow when Sergeant Major Cook was killed. On the top of this box, 3 people have this box. I found these in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and had them engraved with a saying that we used to use whenever we lost a soldier in combat from the command group. And it just says, make it matter. So this box, we used to carry these cards in our pockets until they became too plentiful. Then we started putting them in these boxes. And I've had this on my desk since 2004. And every day I pick out 1 or 2 and just remember where they would be, because in those pictures, they're frozen in time. Just like that first picture I showed you with the faces in World War II. Don't know where any of those guys are. They would be, long gone, I'm sure, right now if they survived the fight, but they would certainly be fathers and grandfathers, and if they had survived. The same with these. These pictures to me are frozen in time. But over the last 10, 15 years since these soldiers were killed as part of our command in combat, I can only imagine how many times they were missed at a dinner table, both men and women, by the way. And in fact, a couple of allies. There's one Lithuanian soldier that was working under our command. But they would have established memories with their children. They might have had a strong marriage. They may have gotten divorced. They may have had great jobs. They may have been homeless. Don't know. But the job, I think, of all of us as we head toward Memorial Day is remember this quote that I saw on a British tombstone one time. This, by the way, is the cemetery in the Netherlands. It's the night where the superintendents put luminarias on each one of the tombstones, 8,000 of them. But our job is to remember them as we go into this Memorial Day weekend. Find ways that we can make things better for our fellow citizens. Not to get political, but let's stop the divisiveness and understand that we are all sacrificing for one thing or another, and that's to form a more perfect union. I'll end with this film.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. The tide has turned. We will accept nothing less than full victory.
On the 6th of June, I landed on Omaha Beach at 6:30 in the morning. The only thought on my mind at that particular time was survival. And you could not help anybody. You were lucky if you made it to shore. And the tide was coming in very fast. They were destined to drown if nobody came to their help. So I dropped what I was doing and I went back to the water. I took as many minutes as I could until I became exhausted. I am not a hero, I just did my job. And the heroes, the real heroes are laying here on the cemeteries. These are our heroes. And we should never forget them.
I'll finish with that and just say, first of all, thank you all for taking a little bit of time out of your Wednesday evening and coming to listen to this story, which very few people know about the American Battle Monuments Commission. I think I'm about right on time, about 1 minute over. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yes, ma'am.
We were showing the map at the beginning of the presentation. I noted that there was one of these ABMC cemeteries in the beginning. Are there any like
that's not a cemetery, that's a monument.
That's a monument.
It's a monument.
Like difficulties associated with some of the more far-flung monuments
and
cemeteries?
Yeah, the one in Tunisia is the hardest. Well, in terms of difficulties of getting there, you mean?
Well, difficulties for the commission to do the work that it does.
No, no. The commission, you go to any of these sites and they are like a green at Augusta. Okay. Every one of them. In fact, if you go to our website and go to cemeteries and monuments, the films that I showed tonight, there's one for each one of them. And you can see how each of them adhere to the standards that we were talking about here. In terms of getting to the places, I think that's why, you know, there are some in Europe, are in some very nice places, Rome, France, Netherlands, you know, that people like to go to or will spend a day there during a vacation. Some of the tougher ones are Tunisia, because there's a security and a terrorist issue there. New Zealand obviously is a monument that a lot of people go to, but it's a combined monument of US, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada in one monument. And it's, you know, taken care of by our folks there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How is teaching in Korea? Maze memorials.
Yeah.
Nice to find out.
We do. Yeah, it is a monument. Again, there's no cemeteries there, but it's a large monument in Busan. And in fact, our secretary was just there about a week ago laying a wreath, but it's hard to get to. Not a whole lot of people, when people go to Korea, they go to Seoul. Busan is not a main tourist area, but it is the site of the landing. So that's why it's there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that telling stories of the fallen soldiers is the best way to ultimate heart, something the heart of a lot of people, especially critics in this country, in time of like religion, the Pledge of Allegiance, and breaking the flag. My question is, as teachers, what do we like from us? How can we memorize or learn some of these stories to tell students we can commemorate and appreciate and you know, hold the many values and explain them?
Yeah, again, I'd suggest you go to our website, and we are in fact putting together programs along with the Smithsonian Institute to talk about the ABMC and the stories of the individuals. Some of the things we're doing on the sites themselves, we have an entire history section of 3 guys who really do the research. And during this year, 2023, we've kind of fanned out, going to a lot of places all over the country, World War I Museum, World War II Museum. We're trying to get things pushed to universities and to secondary schools, not so much primary schools, but I asked the guys before I left, could you do a book, truthfully based on 2 of our grandchildren that said they'd like to know more about it, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. So they're about to publish a book that's child-friendly about honor, sacrifice, courage, things like that, using the ABMC sites as sort of the background to it. So again, all these are on our website. If you're a teacher, we would love to interact with your students. Yes, sir.
One of the visiting generals I think talked to Robert M. Gates, Secretary of Defense in Arlington, and said you take better care of the dead.
I don't. And I'm not sure that's true, but as a guy who thinks a lot more highly of the Veterans Administration than most do, I think they have a tough job in front of them. The one general's speech that really hit me hard was at Anzio with Lucian Truscott. General Lucian Truscott, after the war, came back to the places where he landed with his soldiers in Sicily. And when they dedicated the cemetery, he was the guy that gave the speech. And what he did, with the cemetery behind him, with a podium that was facing the crowd, with a microphone on it, what he did was turned his back on all the congressmen and senators and visitors in the front row. And he talked to those and apologized for anything he had done that caused him to be there. It's a moving speech, and it's online. You can take a look at that. It's really heart-wrenching. You're shaking your head, you know about it. Yeah. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you all very much for coming, and have a great Memorial Day, and do something for others on this coming Monday, as opposed to just going to the mattress sales, if you don't mind. Okay. All right. Thank you all.